But Leonard Cass was a teacher of yours at the University of Chicago.
Leon Cass?
Leon Cass. And then he has that wonderful book on Genesis that's based on seminars he gave there, right, at U of C.
It is, and I had 3 quarters on the Genesis with him. And, I still remember certain things, I remember when, he talked about Abraham, and of course there's a philosophical and religious part to it, but he said, think about this, you're in your 80s or 90s, and God calls you and says, leave everything you know, and you're going to go and start a new country, and the ambition that takes, and the daring it takes. So he taught the Genesis in a way that made you feel that this was about humanity and our ambitions, our greeds, our impulses.
No, quite right. That's a great book. Hey, listen, you mentioned your Hindu and Indian background and the fascinating connection between your grandfather and Mohandas Gandhi.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that. So your grandfather actually worked with Gandhi, went to prison, right?
He went to prison.
Because of his support for Gandhi.
He was younger. He worked with someone called Lala Lajpat Rai, who was part of the Indian freedom movement, but then he went to jail alongside Gandhi in 1942 to 1946 as part of the Indian independence movement. And of course, Gandhi, as you know, famously came up with this idea of satyagraha, which is active resistance, but that's nonviolent, and was heavily influenced by the Gita, but also by the Sermon on the Mount, by Tolstoy. And it's interesting because I think there was a lot of sort of nonviolent interaction with another person, but Gandhi took it that we could do this at a political level.
Right. And I find Gandhi intriguing for so many reasons. And one is what you just referenced, that he comes as a young law student to London, late 19th century, and he's a very shy figure. But eventually he meets a group of Christians who encourage him to read the Bible.
Right.
And like a lot of first-time Bible readers, he found the Old Testament kind of puzzling. But he thrilled to the New Testament, especially Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
And Gandhi finds this teaching on nonviolence. He goes to his Christian friends and says, hey, this is marvelous. And they say, well, we don't take that all that seriously at all, or it's just for private purposes or whatever. But Gandhi realized it was dynamite, and then he used it, And the great thing there is he understood it was not passivity in the presence of evil, but it was a very creative way to engage evil. King, very influenced by Gandhi, and also as a Christian, obviously by Matthew. The other great figure, I think, is John Paul II. So now late 20th century, John Paul II in Poland, up against, a giant army, nuclear weapons and everything. He has none of that, but had that soul force that Gandhi talked about. And, when he speaks of God in front of 1 million people in Warsaw, and they begin chanting, we want God, we want God. Prescient observers, Brzezinski being one of them, said it's over. They realized at that moment the Soviet domination was over because John Paul had unleashed something. So talk about that a little bit. What's still the power of someone like Gandhi? You sit on the Armed Services Committee, right? So you're not obviously an advocate of doctrinaire nonviolence, but yet what are we still able to learn from Gandhi and King, John Paul II today?
Well, they represent, in my view, the highest calling of humanity. So for Gandhi, there was this sense that, okay, if you're faced with evil, and the British Empire at the time was far stronger militarily, that you overcome it with goodness, and that you overcome it not because of weakness. I mean, it was strength, but that force ultimately melts hearts, changes minds. There are scenes from the Indian independence movement where you had people going and getting beaten, and then another row of people would come and get beaten, and another row. And I think it just inspires us for what's the best, the most divine part of human existence. Now, that doesn't mean that as a nation, if you face terrorism, that we're going to with Hamas perpetrators do that. I mean, there's, in my view, a need for force and just force. But in our interactions on a daily basis and in what we can aspire to as humanity, it seems to be the North Star.
You mentioned at least indirectly, the just war tradition within Christianity. So in the very earliest centuries, you have a lot of the church fathers would advocate practically a nonviolent stance. They would say Christians can't participate in the army and so on. It's Augustine in the 4th and in the 5th century who articulates the just war tradition. it's completely misconstrued if you see it as some kind of a warmongering move or an encouragement to war. Just the contrary. Augustine accepted what he called the metaphysics of peace, but he felt that within a fallen, conflictual world, sometimes all you can do to battle gross injustice is to resort to warfare. But he set these, very stringent limits to it. If you apply the Catholic just war criteria, it seems to me, it's hard to find a just war. That's to say, both, justifying going to war, but also the waging of the war. I'm curious about how many people in Congress would know that tradition, would apply that tradition when looking at issues of war and peace. The just war tradition. I'm just curious.
I think there are people who would know it, not obviously to your depth, but would understand that that there are deep ethical principles involved, that we shouldn't just be rushing to war. There's probably been a reflection now, actually in both parties, that over the last 20 years, the United States has gotten into wars without full deliberation, and that there should be more restraint and more thought in how we conduct war and what the human toll is. I mean, I do think on matters of war and peace, people really struggle with it, even if they don't know the tradition. I mean, members do understand the gravity of it. I mean, we're struggling with it today in what's going on in the Middle East and in Ukraine.
Right, because proportionality, discrimination are two key elements when it comes to the waging of war. There's got to be a proportionate response, but also a discriminate one. We make every effort to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. And one of the criteria on the way to war is last resort. I've always been struck by that we've exhausted every other means before we get there. And so the social teaching tradition of the church keeps us from rushing into, armed conflict. But anyway, I think it's very important that we keep those criteria in mind as we think through, those issues.
And I think this is one of the important reasons that we need faith informing politics, right? Because otherwise, someone hits you, someone strikes you, the human response is you want to strike them back. And what faith at its best does is makes us pause and think and say, well, what is the ideal way to live? And that doesn't mean we can always live the ideal way in a, as you put it, fallen world, but certainly it should help shape the action and give us pause, at least give us some sense of deliberation.
Gandhi, King, John Paul II all knew that it was a provocation, real nonviolence, not passivity, but a real provocation, revealing the wickedness of someone to himself, that he might see mirrored back. Right. This is what I'm doing. There's a famous story of John Paul in Poland when General Jaruzelski, who was in charge of Poland at the time, greeted the Pope at the airport, and he had his notes for a little speech, and he stood there and he was trembling because he realized the power of this man. And they say John Paul listened to him very politely and then commenced his own speech. But before he did, he took his papers and he held them out like this, saying, "I'm not afraid of you." And indeed, that was the case. I mean, he had more power than Jaruzelski did.
Right.
And I wonder if we Christians understand that, we believers understand that, the spiritual power that we do wield, Anyway, go ahead.
I think probably not as much as certainly as Gandhi or King or John Paul did. But that's if there ever were a time that this country needed spirituality, it's now. We're so broken as a nation. I mean, you look at the insults we hurl at each other on television. You look at the anger, and there isn't a sense of common purpose. There isn't this sense of where are we headed. And at its best, America is a nation of ideals, of a nation that represents the best of human values. I wasn't a supporter of Ronald Reagan's ideology, but when he would talk about a shining city of the hill and what America could be, that it sent chills for America. And that's the sense, I think, that we have lost. And having spirituality deepen the conversation and also have some humility. Because if you believe in a higher power, then you probably think you don't have the monopoly on the truth.
Let me pursue that with you a little bit, because you mentioned Tocqueville in some of your writings and speaking, and he's kind of an intellectual hero of mine. I would take his main point to be a democracy can't really function, much less flourish, without some undergirding philosophical or religious point of view. So the institutions of a democratic society, both political and economic, are fine in themselves, but they won't really function properly unless the entire society is suffused with a religious sensibility, right? Here's something I've noticed in the years I've been following politics and reading. When I was a young guy, you'd read people on the left politically. They weren't anti-religious. And go back to like my father's heroes. My father's heroes would have been FDR and would have been JFK and Hubert Humphrey and LBJ, right? I can't think of any of those figures as being anti-religious or anti-spiritual. What I've noticed in the last, let's say, 30 years is the left is becoming increasingly hostile to religion. Not even indifferent to it, I mean actively hostile to it. And that worries a lot of us because of the Tocqueville principle. I get it. Religion, like anything else, needs to be criticized, and religious people do and say bad things. I get that. But you can't dismiss religion out of hand as something, primitive and irrational. Think of the new atheist critique from, 20 years ago. But I found it's come into the left as a kind of unsavory element. So talk to me about that, because you just mentioned the importance of the spiritual in a political conversation.
Well, I think it also is important to move people, right? I mean, it's not accidental that King's language is Christian in so many ways. I mean, he says we don't want a thing-oriented society, a people-oriented society. It's not accidental that Gandhi appeals not just to the Bible, but to the Gita and to Hindu faith and to Islamic faith, and because people ultimately aren't just material things. We have higher aspirations, and to touch that, whether it's a sense of patriotism or even higher, a sense of what your obligations are to something beyond just your human existence, is deeply what moves people. So to say that, okay, we're not going to have that conversation impoverishes our ability to have a politics. Now, it comes from this fear that we want to have pluralism in this country, and so I think that the fear was, okay, are we just going to have one faith? But I think America has always, in my view, been a nation of many faiths, and you can celebrate that, and we can create space for that. So I'll give you a very childhood story. When we were moving into to Amsterdam Avenue in Holland, which was one of the neighborhoods. I was born in Philadelphia. We were moving there. There was a bit of chatter in the street in Bucks County, like the Kanas are moving in, and we figured out, what was going on, and that someone said, well, on Christmas Eve, we put candles out, and now are we going to have a house that doesn't have the candle lights out? So my parents kind of laughed, and they said, of course we're going to put the candle lights out. We grew up celebrating Christmas. It doesn't diminish our own faith tradition. And we did that, and we celebrated, and people on the street celebrated Diwali and were curious. And I think that there has, in my view, having a robust engagement with people's faith is a better way than telling people don't have faith in the public square.
Right. And is it possible to have a religious argument in public? And I use that word argument on purpose because I've been saying for years, it looks for a lot of people like there are two options. Either there's just interreligious violence or there's total privatization. Just don't talk about religion. And I would say, no, there's a middle ground, which is robust religious argument that can come out into the public space, not violent, but intellectually engaged. Why couldn't a Hindu and a Christian and a Jew really talk about, and without abandoning their own traditions, but talk out of those traditions and try to find some common ground? My second observation there is in the Catholic tradition, we talk about the natural law tradition.
Right.
So you might say underneath, most of the great spiritual traditions is a deep moral sensibility, and that we can find a common ground. someone like John Courtney Murray in our tradition argued out of that perspective. And that we abandon that at our peril. And then it moves into just a complete either indifferentism or just squabbling in the public square. So, is there a moral consensus that our country can find, call it the natural law consensus, or some fundamental moral sensibility, or are we stuck with endless squabbling at that level?
So I think there's two things. Obviously there was a sense, in my view, first that that the state would have an ability to define the common good, and liberalism emerged saying, well, we've had all these wars, right. We can't agree on this common good, we can't agree whether it's a Protestant, Catholic, Hindu common good. And so we're going to agree to some basic principles, and those principles are to keep the country safe and have people have individual rights. The challenge is that people still want shared purpose. That's right. That's not enough. Procedural justice, though important, though deeply important, is not enough. And so then the question becomes, how do we build something deeper? Now, to me, one of the greatest articulations of this was Frederick Douglass in Composite Nation, where he speaks in 1869, and he talks about defending the right of Chinese immigrants to come to the United States. And he says, and they say, well, they're not Christian. How are you defending them? And they're not American. And he says, in the free air of America and in the free air of our churches, we will have this, and the best will emerge. And this is going to strengthen not only America, it's going to strengthen the churches to have that kind of dialogue. And to me, that sense that pluralism doesn't mean lowest common denominator. Yeah. Pluralism means challenging your ideas, having something thicker, and still having some thicker conception for America that takes from the best of these.
Yeah, and that's the question, that thick description of the moral life. Douglass is so good, isn't he, at so many levels? Still, an important person to go back to. The question of how do you find it? How do you articulate it? How do you find the sense of common good without endless conflict? But that the political should be informed by it. What I militate against is the privatization of religion, which I've seen advancing in my own lifetime. I get wanting to avoid violence, but I don't think it should move in the direction of privatizing it. Christianity cannot be a private religion because we're salt of the earth and light for the world, and we're the city on the hill and all that. It doesn't mean you propagate it violently or through aggression. But you do propagate it, by your witness and by your words, and I would say indeed by your public argument. Right. So I try to find that space.
Do you feel that people feel judged or censored or not allowed to have that kind of perspective? Going to a town hall, making a religious argument, do you think it's?
I think increasingly in our society that's the case, and. Even the suspicion of Christian symbols and, as you were talking about, religious symbols in the public space. Because we don't want it to move in that direction of a kind of emptied out, Richard John Newhouse's famous, naked public square is just denuded of any religious or moral point of reference. We can't have that. And I think that's one of the inflection points in our conversation, around religion.
Yeah. And I don't think, when I think back to my parents putting out the candlelights or my tweeting out your piece on Christmas, I don't think it's a shallowness, right? Some people say, it's just the commercialization of Christmas and now everyone has elf on the shelf and is giving gifts. It's something deeper. It's about trying to respect and share what is holy and important to someone else and trying to celebrate that. And the other person reciprocating that in you. Now, maybe that gets to some common ground. Maybe that strengthens the appreciation for a common direction. But if all I'm saying to you, Bishop Barron, is, well, I respect your right to exist and me not to hit you and me not to steal from you, that's not as deep a bond as if I say, well, I want to celebrate and understand things that matter to you.
Is there a teleology to our political life? I guess is the question. Is it actually going somewhere? Are we heading toward a common good? Or is it more that procedural, element you're talking about? Is it merely protective or directive. That's, I think, in terms of classical political philosophy. Modern political philosophy tends to say the purpose of government is protective, to protect our rights, protect us from violating each other's rights. But classical political philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, Aquinas, would be directive. The purpose of government is to direct us towards some clear sense of the common good. Now, I know that shattered at modernity of the Enlightenment, that consensus around the common good, and we're the inheritors of that moment, it seems to me, that shattered. So we're left with a kind of proceduralism that's good, but not enough, as you're saying. So that's what we, I think, all need to think through in a fresh way. And then we're always haunted by the specter of violence. The minute you're talking about here's the common good, here's the good that we should all be seeking, and someone goes, well, I don't agree with that. And then that's my point about argument. Well, can we find a place to argue about it anyway, publicly, without killing each other or without falling into complete polarization? To my mind, that's the central struggle maybe in the political life today.
I completely agree with you, and I think what our nation is trying to do is unprecedented. I mean, there has never been a cohesive, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy on the face of the earth. And so we're trying to do this. And it's not enough to just have procedural justice. We want to have a common good, right? A nation is not, when people say America is just an idea, well, yes, it's an idea in the Constitution, but it's also the Revolutionary War, and it's also the blood spilled in the Civil War, and it's also World War II and the Cold War. It's stories and events, and a nation isn't just ideas. And so we need to have this common sense of a nation, and yet we have all different folks and different faiths and different traditions coming in. Where do you have a common purpose? I mean, at the very least, it should be, in my view, the engagement and respect of each other, and listening and thinking and the humility. But then how do we build this purpose? And in my view, becoming a cohesive multiracial democracy is probably a civilizational achievement for America.
Yeah. I think of John Paul II there, who said the most fundamental of all the rights is religious liberty, the right to religious freedom, because it touches the very deepest part of every person. So that's one side of it, isn't it? It's like to allow that, say, yes, I'm offering complete religious liberty. But then within that context, religiously free people coming into a shared space and having a real conversation with each other. That's the next step. If we just say, okay, we're all free and I'll let you be, you let me be, then that's not enough for a cohesive society. But now can we enter this common space and really talk to each other? So anyway, I think we're not going to solve that today, but I think that's the issue.
And do you think it is? Do you find leaders, without making it partisan, who are on either side, who are able to speak in a spiritual sense to give common direction, purpose to America?
Not nearly enough. No, I would say that I don't see that in the public conversation.
Because King did, right?
King did, absolutely. King did. And look at the top leadership of the civil rights movement was religious. They weren't just part of it. The top leadership was. Is that the case now? I don't know. I don't think so. So that's the challenge, I think, is for spiritually minded people to get into that conversation and to lead it, as King did. Hey, let's talk a little bit about economics. So that's really your background and what you studied, what you taught at Stanford.
It may sound more coherent on the economics as opposed to philosophy.
You're plenty coherent on philosophy too. But we'll move into your wheelhouse. As I read you on these economic matters, you seem to be a great advocate of a kind of targeted investment in the economy so as to stimulate it and make it stronger and to make it fairer and to draw more people into it. And that strikes me as congruent with Catholic social teaching, which favors the market economy. The Catholic social teaching doesn't like the word capitalism, rarely uses it because I think it's so loaded. It uses the term market economy, which it sees as the economic correlate, I think, of a free political environment. So how do free people engage economically through the free market? However, the church does not say, laissez-faire, just unregulated market. By no means. It should be regulated both politically, governmentally, and morally. The market has got to be circumscribed morally and politically. But as I read the church's social teaching, not so that the government can control the market, but to make the market fairer and more available to more people. Talk about that a little bit. I just find a certain point of contact with your own thinking on economics.
Well, I love how you frame that about how do we shape the market, because that to me is the big question. I mean, obviously, there's a value in the market of freedom. You don't want, if I want to have some interaction with you, I don't need to go to the government to get every interaction approved. But what has happened is, what if you have a society which is just transacting, and it so happens that in my district, you now have $10 trillion of value. And by the way, all this capital is going to China because they have the lowest wage labor there. And places like Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and Ashtabula and Downriver, Michigan are just hollowed out. And you have no ability for those folks to engage in that transaction. And so to me, the market has to care about community, has to care about place. There has to be some understanding that you can't just have the concentration of opportunity. You can't just have capital, especially globally, go to the cheapest labor. There have to be certain standards, and there has to be certain economic opportunity for people who want to live in the place that they call home. They may want to, we just think people are actors in a market. And so you're saying to someone, okay, go get retrained, go move. Well, what about their home church?
I want to stay here.
What about their family? What about their community? Why are those not also important values? And I think this has been another source of the polarization in our country. One is the challenge of figuring out a common good, but the other is that some people have a much better chance of economic opportunity than others, and depending on where you were born.
You're finding common ground with Republicans too on this, aren't you?
I am.
With Marco Rubio.
With Marco Rubio.
Tell me about that, your kind of collaboration with him on this.
Well, Marco Rubio, to his credit, and if you ask us for the diagnosis of the problem, it's almost identical. We said, look, there's been the hollowing out of manufacturing in this country. I don't know what we were thinking in terms of going from the biggest exporter of steel to now the biggest importer of steel. 9 out of the 15 steel plants in China. Rubio would say the same thing. And town after town losing industry, and we didn't do anything. If you go to these communities, there's a sense of betrayal, of anger at both the whole political system. And so what Marco Rubio and I are saying is it's okay to have a strategy of economic development. Every other country has that. That doesn't mean that we don't have the market. That doesn't mean that we don't have private sector. But our government, which is the most powerful institution ever invented in human history, should care about making sure that communities have economic opportunity. And we should care that the critical modern industries are here and that America be a manufacturing superpower, an economic superpower. It's not just Marco Rubio. I've worked with people like Mike Gallagher on this, who's the chair of the China Select Committee. I mean, this is, I think, one hopeful strand for the United States. And this, I'd love your thoughts, Bishop Barron. If it is hard for us to have a thicker conception of the common good, right? But Marco and I agreeing on issues of abortion, where I'm, just candidly for reproductive rights. I don't want to mischaracterize however he wants to characterize his position on that. If those are hard conversations for us as a nation, how can we find common ground at least on the economics? It's maybe not at the highest plane, but building us as a superpower on manufacturing, building us economically. Can we at least find some common ground there that starts to move this country in a place where we can push for our convictions on issues where we disagree, have a robust debate, do it respectfully, but also at the same time not be paralyzed?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, for Catholic social teaching, a healthy economy is a high moral value. So a healthy economy is producing jobs and helping families and helping a nation develop and creating wealth and all of that. That's a moral consideration. John Paul II said that the Catholic social teaching is key to the new evangelization. So if you want to evangelize, one way to do that is to make a moral commitment to improving the economy. So no, I think I'd be with you there. And hasn't Marco Rubio called his position a common good conservatism?
Right? He has.
So a conservatism, but it's not a libertarianism or not kind of just free market anything goesism, but rather one that's directed toward the common good. And you sound in some ways like Ronald Reagan. I hope you don't see that as an insult, but I mean, Reagan, who certainly would have favored, keeping business here and making it stronger, and
he
not
did
simply
with Semitech, with the semiconductor industry.
Right.
And obviously, I have ideological differences with him, but I'll tell you the one thing that Ronald Reagan had when he gave the speech that if you go to Japan, you as an immigrant, you can't be Japanese, and if you go to France, you can't be French. My parents came here as immigrants. I was born here in Philadelphia in 1976. My wife often jokes saying, you take credit for that, but you had nothing to do with your birthplace or year. But, a bicentennial baby, born in Bucks County, and at the age of 40, a grandson of someone who was a freedom fighter in Indian colonialism, a son of Indian immigrants, is elected to represent the economically most powerful place in the world in terms of wealth.
That's us at our best.
That's America.
That's America at the best.
That wouldn't happen in Germany. That wouldn't happen in France. That wouldn't happen in other places. And so what we need, whether it's an Obama in this way or a Reagan, we need people, again, to believe in the aspirational story of America. This is the greatest nation ever conceived. And some things, the thing that bothers me the most about our moment is the sense of losing that. We were losing that sense of how special this place is, how much sacrifice has gone into where we are.
Yeah. Hey, can I ask you something with the American ideals in mind? This famous debate today between what I call equality of opportunity versus equity of outcome. So in a lot of the woke debates today, there seems to be a stress on equity of outcome, that we need to just, render the whole society racially or in terms of gender or whatever it is, ethnically equal. And I've always stood on the side of more of the classical liberal position of Thomas Jefferson and I would say Martin Luther King.
Right.
It's not equity of outcome that we want, it's equality of opportunity.
Right.
That's the great American ideal. And equity of outcome, in fact, would call for an extraordinary manipulation of the society, an extraordinary intervention of the government and into the economy and all that. Help me with that. Bill Maher asked Bernie Sanders that question. Is it equality of opportunity, equity of outcome? And Sanders said it's equality of opportunity. And I thought, good. Give me your thought on that.
Yeah, no, I'm obviously for an equality of opportunity. I mean, people should have the basic health care, education to make a life. But then if you had equality of results, that would mean that everyone would be making the same amount of money and have to be in the same houses. And
51% should be women in every aspect of life, and 10%.
That's not respecting a person's individual initiative and ambition. Where I think it becomes more challenging is, let's say, equality of opportunity requires people to get to a 5, right, in a race. And some people are starting out at a 2, and other people are starting out at a 0 or a -2. Then the question for a society becomes, do we do more to help the person at a -2 to get to the 5?
And that's been the affirmative action argument for a long time, right? And as far as it goes, I think fine.
But it's and I think that and I wish we could have that honest conversation in good faith instead of where people are saying, look, we don't want an equality of outcome. We want equality of opportunity. And then let's discuss where that is and how that is. But it becomes so politicized that you can't do that.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I wonder if this question will get you in trouble with your own constituency. But another part of Catholic social teaching, which I think is congruent with your thinking as I'm understanding it, Catholic social teaching doesn't like hyper concentrations of wealth and power.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Look at G.K. Chesterton, who's an intellectual hero of mine. And he proposed back in the early part of the 20th century a system that he called distributism. And he saw it as in between socialism and a pure capitalism. And the idea there was distributing wealth.
Right.
Now, not through the mechanism of the government necessarily, but finding ways to distribute wealth and power throughout the society. And look at his disciples, C.S. Lewis. Tolkien is a good example. You know, that a suspicion of a hyper-technologized capitalism that rapes the environment and all that. And they favored a breaking up. Think of like Saruman in The Lord of the Rings, kind of controlling everything. And
Right.
That's the tradition that's coming out of Catholic social teaching. So as you said, you've got in your own district some of the greatest hyper concentration of wealth and power in the history of the human race. So let me ask just provocatively, should there be another Teddy Roosevelt? I mean, to break up these trusts, should we break up Google and Facebook, and why not?
Well, some of them, I think Facebook we should have, because they've concentrated Instagram and WhatsApp that should have been separate and having competition. And I've supported stronger antitrust enforcement on these companies so that they're not able to abuse their platforms, and there are definitely antitrust violations. But I think it's going to require something beyond just antitrust, because let's say you had, and I'm not saying it's we shouldn't consider it, but let's say you had 3 Googles all in Palo Alto, and you then had 2 different Apples, and you had 4 different 3 different Facebooks, and you have the AI revolution in my district. That's not going to do much for people in Youngstown, Ohio, right? And so I think the harder challenge is the internet was supposed to be distributed, and it ended up being concentrating. And how do we now intentionally figure out incentives to distribute the economic opportunity and technology jobs? And that's what I've really been pushing, with getting Google to partner with community colleges, historically black colleges, Hispanic institutes, and rural communities. So antitrust, I would say, is one quiver, but not the whole solution.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Another, I think, instance of a hyper-concentration of wealth in our society are the universities with these staggering endowments. Look at what's Harvard. It's like $50 billion, something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, part of me is at my Chesterton side, my Catholic social teaching side, said, give me a break. Why any university would need a $50 billion endowment? And to be fair, Notre Dame has a $20 or $25 billion endowment. Is this a good idea? Should there be that much wealth concentrated in these universities? Heck, for $1 billion, how about start a university in Africa? How about start a university in, you know what I'm saying? Is that another example where I don't know who would do it, but somehow break up that extraordinary monopolizing of wealth?
Well, I would say this. I mean, there in some ways, I believe that higher education and universities, and I welcome your view on this, is it has been a huge asset for the United States of America. And that these universities have produced research, but they've also produced a sense of openness and scholarship at its best for the country. The challenge has become, I think, some of it the gamesmanship of people contributing to these places to be on the boards or to get their kids in, and that needs to be cleaned up in terms of what to do. And then, and naming buildings. I mean, there are probably other better uses of people's free money. It's not for them to decide what they want to do, but there are probably better causes than just giving all of your wealth to your alma mater to get a building named. I'm reluctant to go after universities, because I will say this. I think that there has been anti-intellectualism at the basis of some of the critiques of higher education, in my view. I mean, look, I think the country did a terrible disservice to people who didn't go to college and hollowed out the manufacturing, hollowed out the middle class. But the flip of that shouldn't be, okay, we don't need PhDs, we don't need graduate students, we don't need college degrees. I think there's got to be a balance. Thomas Piketty is, I don't agree with all his conclusions, but he has this great research that in the 1950s, almost 80% of Americans were going to high school, compared to 30% in Europe. It gave us this huge advantage. And so I do want us to still invest in education in all forms.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, of course. But something I found encouraging, actually, in my experience in recent years, the number of kids who are saying to me, "When I'm not going to college, I want to become a plumber. I want to become an auto mechanic."
Which is fantastic.
I'm like, and I say, terrific. A, you'll make a lot of money. I'll tell them. And B, I mean, maybe not everybody is suited for university studies. My parents' generation, rare was the person that went to college. Neither of my parents went to college.
And I do think this gets to some of the elitism, right? Just because you went to college doesn't make you smarter or better or a better citizen or morally superior to someone who didn't. And there is this kind of snobbery of the college educated that I think is not called for. I mean, a person who doesn't go to college can have a great life, can have incredible opinions and thoughts, and should be given as much credence in their opinions as especially when it comes to democratic matters, as someone who's a PhD.
I think of it like a Tolkien again, with the hobbits staying close to home and making their own tools and doing their own work. And that was, now it's romanticized, obviously, but that was an ideal that they were embracing against a sort of elitism, I think. Hey, let me ask you a couple of particular issues that were really big when I was in California. I was out there for 6 years. I lived in Santa Barbara. I was auxiliary bishop for Los Angeles, so I came to know Southern California, The homeless issue got demonstrably, visibly worse in the 6 years I was there.
Right.
It was bad enough when I arrived in L.A. It was much worse when I left. Yeah. As I looked at it over those years, I couldn't find a politician that was able to deal with this or had a reasonable solution. And it got worse, for sure. Give me the row kind of, I know I'm oversimplifying, but give me 3 steps you would do to deal with this problem, which now it's all over my city here, Rochester. Yeah. It's all over the country, homelessness. Help me with that.
It's a huge challenge in California. First, we have to acknowledge that.
Right.
And partly it comes also where you have high wealth concentration, because when you have a lot of wealth production, people bid on the housing prices go up, it makes it harder for people to afford rent. So if you look statistically around the country, places which have high wealth generation and disparity end up often having significant housing problems. So what are 3 things? One, California didn't build enough housing. We were just too restrictive in some of the zoning. And that was a big mistake. Don't copy California's build housing policy. We should be building a lot more housing, not just affordable housing, but housing in general. The second thing is make sure you're intervening before someone is evicted in terms of providing assistance. People say folks have an addiction problem, mental health problems. There are a lot of people who have addiction problems and mental health problems who are housed, and that's much better than before they get evicted. And so I would have a program of aggressively monitoring people who are on their feet and making sure before they get evicted they have some assistance. And then the third point would be really having more mental health and wellness and counseling in communities. And of course, gets back to Tocqueville, right? I mean, one of the reasons Tocqueville said you needed religious institutions, he said in a place where you have freedom could go to licentiousness. We may not have any order, and we need family and community and religion to give our life some social purpose, so it's not just our own whims. And in a society as complex as ours, we want religious institutions, others to do that, but we also want mental health wellness centers that give people an opportunity to get back on their feet. Those would be the 3.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's just been such a intractable problem, hasn't it? And,
it really has.
I look Democrat, Republican, look across the spectrum, and we just don't seem to find a solution. Speaking of which, the other issue that it certainly preoccupies the bishops of our country, since I became a bishop 8 years ago, we talk about it every single meeting. And that's immigration. Yes. When I was in California, obviously it was front and center issue, but it's all over our country. Everyone says it's like a cliche, almost a broken system. And I think that's true. Catholic social teaching, and this is a very important part of it, it says yes to a nation's right to define and defend its borders, and not just for xenophobic or jingoistic reasons. There are good moral reasons for that. To maintain if an economy can't handle this huge influx of people or whatever it is. There are good moral reasons. And to be honest with you, I think sometimes as a church we're not as good at articulating that there's a moral reason why a nation can defend its borders. Okay, that's one feature of it. The other, of course, born of Jesus and the New Testament and the prophets, is a great openness to the poor and to the marginalized and those who are threatened in their home country and all of that. By a deep instinct, we say, yes. And then as Americans, Statue of Liberty, the huddled masses. I mean, so there's all these instincts in us, both American and Catholic, that say yes, with the caution of defending borders. Okay, that seems to me at the principle level where we are.
And I agree with that framework. I think you would get 90% of Congress agreeing
so
with what
how come we can't solve it? That's what frustrates a lot of us is, all right, I think we all kind of agree on those great principles. What's the main problem? Why can't we solve this?
I think the challenge has become it's so politicized. I mean, there's a sense, I think, from some, and I don't want to be unfair about it, but there is a sense for some that they maybe on our side that we're not doing enough to protect the border. Like we, in my view, should be funding border agents. We should be funding immigration judges. We should be funding technology. We should clearly say a nation needs safe and secure borders, and there's and not be demonizing the border patrol or not funding it. On the other hand, there also needs to be a recognition that that immigration is still enriching to the United States, and and there's got to be a pathway for people to come here. If there was a more orderly process, if you didn't have these awful scenes at the border where people are being raped and where people to get to the border and where they're being harassed, and it's this terrible, terrible journey. And if you didn't have the concentration of migrants in cities where they're not being able to work and where they're becoming a drain, I think that a lot of the immigrants have integrated into the country. And so the question is, how do we have an orderly asylum process? How do we have an orderly process to come into the United States in a way that respects the rule of law? And it's politically charged.
But we can't find majorities in both houses that would agree with what you just said. It seems puzzling to me that we're not able to, over many, many years now, it's been years of trying to adjudicate this thing. And I don't know. What you're saying makes perfect sense to me.
It's not going to happen in the 2024 election because we're so divided as a country. And then there's a deeper issue of what's going on in this country, and that gets back to the point that we're trying to do something unprecedented. We're trying to become this multiracial, cohesive, multiracial democracy. And so people say, okay, it's fine if they play cricket in Rose District. Let's just make sure baseball remains the national pastime. And this is a real conversation that we need to have in this country, is how do we embrace the new without discarding the old, the tradition? Where is that balance? And so much of our fight is the inability to see that nuance, that there are certain traditions of this country that we should embrace and that we make room for the new without just jettisoning the old. But it seems to me that the immigration debate is caught up on that, with some people saying change is happening too fast versus others saying, no, we're still going to be this great melting pot of America.
Yeah, that's helpful. We're coming toward the end of our time. You knew I'd eventually get to this point where probably you and I have greatest disagreement, and that's around the abortion question.
And I want your advice on this too.
Yeah.
And the advice, because we have difference. I am, just because so your viewers know, candidly, I mean, I've been 100% supportive of reproductive rights, and we'll talk about it in more detail. But how can we have a conversation in this country where we disagree on issues on abortion, or if there are issues of gay marriage or other things? How do we find, if there is any possibility of a way to talk to each other?
Well, I think two things. First of all, the appeal to natural law that we talked about earlier. There's some kind of fundamental moral consensus around these ethical questions. I think if we can stand together in those, that would be at least a starting point. The other one, to be frank with you, to my mind, the Democratic position on that has become so extreme that it's precluding real conversation. It's become such an extreme position. Let me tell you, put it in a little context. I'm from Chicago. I'm a Catholic, right? My dad, Irish Catholic from Chicago. That meant ipso facto Democrat. If you're a Chicago Catholic, you're a Democrat. In fact, my father was involved in Democratic politics. His family was very involved in Chicago politics. When I went to the seminary, so back in the early 80s, 95% of us, so these, serious Catholic young people, 95% of us would have said we're Democrats, right? When I started teaching at the seminary 20-some years later, 95% would have said we're Republicans. It's one reason for that, I would say, above all, and it was Roe v. Wade, it was abortion. And as I've watched it over the years, I'm old enough to remember, as a little kid, Ted Kennedy was pro-life, Jesse Jackson was pro-life. And they were pro-life, it seems to me, on very democratic grounds. They mean, hey, we're the party of the little guy, we're the party that defends, the poor and those that have no voice. And so I watched that, and then I watched by a steady process abortion being accepted almost as an absolute. I remember vividly Mario Cuomo, 1984, right, at Notre Dame. I was in my mid-20s then. And the anguished Mario Cuomo, I'm a Catholic, and so of course I'm against abortion, but yet with, reluctance, but accepting the exigency of it politically, I will support it, but, I'm a tortured soul, right? And I'm privately against it, but publicly for it. And of course, that was picked up by Democrats, Catholic Democrats, for the next 2 generations. But what I find intriguing is the declension from anguished Mario to exultant, Andrew. So when Andrew Cuomo in New York, when they passed a law that makes abortion, universally available up to the moment of birth, they're lighting up buildings in New York and jumping with celebration. For a lot of Catholics, it was like, come on. I might give a certain benefit of the doubt to anguished Mario, but exultant Andrew, it seemed like it had gone to such an extreme position that it's all on one side, and that it's precluding the possibility for real conversation. I've said to friends of mine in Washington involved in politics, give us a little bit. I said, how about we limit, third trimester abortions? Oh no, that could never happen. How about partial birth? Why don't we limit that? Oh no, it would never pass. How about born alive? Oh no, we couldn't do that. And I'm like, well, then what the heck? How can we even have a conversation if the position has become so extreme? Anyway, end of speech on that. But that would be, from my perspective, as someone born and raised a Democrat, but who experienced extraordinary difficulty precisely over this issue.
And you think this is one of the big issues that Catholic Democrats just sociologically left the Democratic Party?
Yep. Oh, I do. Look at who was the last pro-life Democrat? Dan Lipinski, whom I knew in Chicago, hounded out of office.
What about, I know you may push back on this, but the framework at least in my state in California is that you can have an abortion up till viability, and then after that, it's an exception for the health of the mother in that circumstance, which is very, very rare. It's not a common thing that people are doing. And now my view is that decision should be for the woman and her doctor in getting that health care. But I think the challenge is that we also start to talk about these exceedingly rare cases that then become the conversation, where that's not the majority of abortions, or by any stretch, probably less than 1 or 2% that are taking place.
Well, let's say even if that were the case, that it is still a lot of babies being murdered from our perspective. Right. And how is that ever acceptable within a decent society? So that's, and now that the thing has moved to the state level after the Dobbs decision, okay, good. I'll take any restriction I can get. So if Democrats are willing to say, look, we'll restrict it here or there, great. And the church, I think, would embrace that and say, good, at least we're moving in the right direction. But I think we have to have a conversation about life and about the human being. And, to me, it's become almost an ideological position that prior to birth, for some reason, what we're talking about is not a human being. And I think that's an incoherent position. I remember Hillary Clinton, it must have been 2016, and was asked about that. The baby about to be born has no constitutional rights. And she said, yes, that's the law of our country. And I remember thinking, okay, then something has deeply gone wrong with the laws of our country. So I would say I'm speaking for a lot of Catholics there who would, by instinct, like an awful lot of things within, the more liberal or democratic framework. But we balk at this,
And it's hard if there is just fundamental difference, though not judging someone's view. You think it is hard to build consensus on other areas. I mean, this is such
it's hard. You can, and indeed, I think our conversation might represent that. Even that we can find a lot of points of contact, but it's a big issue.
Yes, of course.
The bishops have called it the preeminent issue for two reasons. One is it's a direct attack on life, and secondly, the sheer numbers involved of roughly 1 million abortions a year. And we just think that's a staggering outrage morally. So for that reason, the bishops have said it's the preeminent issue, not the only one. And we take very seriously all these things we've talked about. And I think with Democrats, we can find a lot of common ground. As I say, most of us, when I was young, most of us were Democrats. And this has been, a very tough pill to swallow,
Well, it's a challenge for the country because obviously this is I disagree with people on the other side, but I don't claim to know metaphysical questions. I mean, these are deep questions that that I respect people who have a difference. I have a clear sense that for me. These things should be the decision between a woman and health care, and that's the law requires health considerations after viability. But I'm not saying that this can bridge a divide, and I don't want to diminish the moral sentiment or moral intensity on the other side. But I think that there is such a moral conviction on both sides on this, that the question becomes, one, can we have this conversation? But it also becomes, how do we at least respect where people are coming from? Which means in a simple way to say that if someone disagrees with me, I won't label them a sexist, and if someone and they shouldn't label me a baby killer. I mean, how do we have conversations with each other?
No, quite right.
That still allow us to have a common American identity and build for that, because it's harder for me to see a path to consensus over the next 10 years on that than it is to see we want to become a manufacturing superpower. We don't want China to lead. We want to make sure we have jobs and economic opportunity everywhere. We want to become this great multiracial democracy.
Yeah, and it's a thorny question to be sure. And I think just to keep creating the space where the conversation can unfold is a good thing. I'm in favor of that. And I would say the recovery of something like a natural law framework so that we're not just asserting our freedom over against each other. That's a non-starter, it seems to me. Well, here's my point of view, your point of view, we'll vaguely tolerate each other. Can we find at least some moral common ground, to talk about it? I would encourage that. But no, I think there's plenty of room for conversation and for agreement on some, pretty important things. And the church takes very seriously the political conversation. As I say, the political conversation has enormous moral implications. The church would kind of stand with Aristotle. Politics is a moral enterprise, right? First and foremost. It's not something divorced from morality. It's a pragmatic concern off to the side. No, it's by its nature a moral project, the political project. So I think, I hope our conversation today is a good example of how we can pursue that conversation.
Well, I've enjoyed it. I've learned from your perspective and erudition. We live in a country where the incredible is possible, and I think that the one thing we both share is this profound love for this nation, of the genius of every individual. I mean, that's so unusual, and I maybe end with this perspective, and I do think this is consistent with, or you tell me if it is, but it's consistent with Catholic teaching, and that is that for most societies, the people who could have a good life were the few, the rulers,
Yeah.
the aristocrats, the scholars.
Right.
And we had this radical idea that
Yes.
there's a genius of every individual. There is every person has deep worth. Every person has a divinity and a specialness. And that's a uniquely American concept. And that's what makes this country exceptional, so unique in my view.
Yeah, no, the possibility of really distributing wealth and power so it's not just in the hands of a few. Yeah, I think that's exactly an American and a Catholic ideal at the same time. Congressman, thank you. A delight talking to you today.
I really enjoyed it. Thank
God
you for
bless
having me.
Thanks.
Thank you.